I keep going and forget. Why won't those files load? I hate OneDrive. You're not in my study hall. I don't care what you guys say. So, Brandon's gone. Michaela's gone. That's it. So, I said I gave you until Wednesday if you had any changes you want to make to your test. I said I'd give you a chance for some of the short IDs because I really want short IDs. I give you through today. And so then my 7th period, my prep period before I go home, I will enter the grades for the test into the grade book. Sound good? Kind of want to wait till I got the revisions and all that. So, you're filmed. Good. Would you like some homework? Yes. You must read 260 to 272 for Friday. And then as luck would have it, I originally assigned it, I was going to assign it yesterday, and somebody forgot to tell you. So, 260 to 272. And also, Bill of Rights in the flag book, 108 to 109. A very nice little concise reading of the Bill of Rights. And as luck would have it, we're going to have an easy matching quiz on the Bill of Rights on Monday. So I'll literally just have the amendments. That's what I'm going to have is a brief little explanation of the amendments, and then the Bill of Rights. Yeah. The review book.
Oh.
You want flag book or review book? Review book? Okay, we'll go to review book. The review book. Are we recording? That's a good question. And the quiz would literally be brief explanation, the 10 amendments. It should be easy. All right. Now, what do we have coming up? I'm missing something here. Oh, I was going to give it tomorrow, but I'm going to give it either tomorrow or Friday a little sheet on how to write an essay. It won't be that big of a deal. We've already done some elements of it. You done essays in other class for certain things I need for essays and certain things that will help you with the AP exam. So I try to combine them. So we'll talk about writing an essay next week. So we'll have an essay test next week on the Federalist era on the writing of the Constitution. Sound good? I'll give you 3 choices. You have to write 4 essays. Yes. 5? Okay, 5 essays. Good. I'm with that.
So is it like a long?
Yeah. No document.
Is there limits? Or do you just get? Yeah.
When we get documents, it becomes document-based question. You'll get between 7 and 8 documents. Short documents. We'll talk about it. It's a regular essay. You just basically have to use the document, a sentence or 2 to show how the document readable to short. So instead of using all evidence, you have to use some of the evidence from the documents. In a way that helps you, in a way that's kind of a pain because you got to go through the documents. There's a lot of gray area. So on that note, where are we finishing here? Because I am so now far off. I'm just all over the place. Did we get to this?
Yes.
We're past that?
Yeah.
What was the rebellion in Western Massachusetts? Shays' Rebellion. And they were almost all, and what did Massachusetts do? Why were they so mad at the Massachusetts government? What were they doing about the money? Creating deflation for whom? Creditors, not printing money. What state did print money? Now, I should add, just because you print money doesn't mean there's more money in circulation. So that might not cause inflation or deflation. It has to be being spent. If I gave all of you $1 million, you immediately buried it in jars in your backyard, that would do nothing to affect the money supply. It has to be spent. And my guess is that's what you would do, because $1 million is nothing to you people have, right? You just that. Yeah, I know. All right, so with that, so we got to this big state, small state. Oh, it's put down. What did the national government do to stop Shays' rebellion? The national government, the Articles of Confederation. Yeah, they couldn't do anything. But you're right, the Massachusetts government paid off basically urban poor to put down rural poor, or working class. And a lot of people decided that we've got to reform the Articles because there's too much what? Or the mobocracy. We got to put a stop to this. So we got to hear Madison, the father of the Constitution. So right here? Here? Nebraska? Here? Here? Great compromise. The first of 3 compromises. And this is also something that's called the Connecticut Plan. And this was the compromise of time together. And nobody was really satisfied with this compromise. I remember being told in junior high, I know that's back nearly when this was written, but I remember being told how, and they were so pleased with what they have done, the perfect document. No, they're actually like, well, I guess it's better than nothing. And there were a lot of, they knew there were problems, but at the same time, they got the main elements passed. And so Roger Sherman, one of the authors of the Declaration of Independence, and that's supposedly Sherman. Remember I told you about the seat that had the rising sun behind? That's where they show Washington with this weird sun, almost. And yes, it's supposed to kind of look like a halo. So they started to deify Washington. That was made long after he was dead. But bicameral, 2 houses. The lower house would be called the House of Representatives. So this is the lower house. So they're basically following Madison's model, and that's why we call this why we call Madison the father of the Constitution. And House of Representatives, the lower house. And it will be apportioned by population. So the bigger the population, the more seats. The lower the population, the fewer, the minimum 1 seat. Originally, they decided that well, in the Constitution, the 50,000 people, you get a seat. I think you might see the problem. Eventually, they ran out of room in the in fact, they ran out of room out of the first capital that they would build in this thing they created called the District of Columbia. They added on and ran out of room of that in 1921, and that's why they limited it. And what it is today, everybody write this down, 435 members of the House. Which is pretty amazing. The United States was about 120 million people when they did that. Now it's about 365 million people, and we're still at 435. And so it has not matched the population growth. It would probably be more representative if it was like, 1,000 members. And there's every once in a while there's talk of that, but there's lots of reasons why that doesn't happen. And one very legitimate reason, where do we put everybody? We have to rebuild the Capitol. And so with that, the voters would choose them, and they get a 2-year term. So every 2 years, there's an election. And so in 2022, there will be an election, and every single member, all 435 members of the House, will be up for re-election. And so we call this will be a midterm. And then when the president is elected, which is every 4 years, that's called the presidential election. Every 2 years. And the voter. So this is the only one that's relatively close to the people. But don't forget, most people can't vote. And every state decides their own voting rules. which is the way it is to this day. In fact, in 71, they ratified the Constitution to say 19-year-olds could, or 18-year-olds could vote. But before that, it could be any age the states wanted, essentially. Most had settled on, some had been 18, 19, some had 21. Every state had property requirements, and so some had really big property requirements, some had almost none, some had taxpayer requirements, and so most people could not vote. And so only the elite voted. And so there's a lot of barriers. There's limitations to voting, and then the elite voters pick the elite of the elite. Okay? They did not like that over there. And so that's the House of Representatives. And the thought was this would be really turbulent. It was so close to the people that it would be kind of wild and crazy. And the word you want to write down is they thought this would be radical. Now, let's be honest. How radical would it be if it's the elite of the elite? They're not going to be that radical. But the thought was they would be more radical. The upper house would be a check on that, just like the House of Lords used to be a check on the House of Commons in Parliament. Oh, I almost forgot. Tax bills start here. And this is a legacy of the British Parliament. In the House of Commons, this goes back to the Magna Carta back in 1215. Your Parliament will decide the purse strings, the tax bills. So any tax laws or spending laws must start in the House. They must start in the House. Now, there are ways around this, and they kind of fudge the laws, but for the most part, that's the way it goes. The Senate, this is also the upper house. This is the upper house. And that's 2 per state. That's the big compromise. 2 per state. So how many members of the Senate are there today? 100. Math. I know. 100 members. So I should add, if there is a tie in the Senate, who breaks the tie? Yeah, the vice president breaks the tie in the Senate. So right now, there is a tie in the Senate. There's 50 Republicans and 50 Democrats. But because the United States has a Democratic president and a Democratic vice president, the Democrats have a majority. And so with that, originally, state assemblies chose it. State assemblies chose the Senate. Imagine if one of the lower house choose the upper house, but states didn't like that. So members of the state assembly picked the senator. But you notice I crossed that out. Because in 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified, and now the voters in the state, with all the same restrictions that voters have in every state. Every state has different laws for voters to this day. Heck, every county has different laws in most states, including Montana. It's kind of remarkable how complex American elections are, which also makes it kind of a pain to vote. But the 17th Amendment did this. But remember, the original thought. The elite voters elect the elite of the elite to the state assemblies, who then would elect the elite of the elite to the elite to the Senate. So the Senate was going to be this elite body. And you notice they have longer terms. So the idea would be this stately a group of patriots and learned men above the lower house. And what they would do is this, and put some kind of arrow or something, they would check or control the power of the House. They would stop radical action in the House. And that's why in the Constitution it says that the House and the Senate will make their own rules. That's part of the reason why the Senate, by allowing unlimited debate, would have something I've told you about before, and I wrote it up on the board here, the filibuster, where the Senate requires only 40 votes to stop any law in the Senate, almost any law. They have finally changed the Senate to allow for confirmation of judges, and then they have this unbelievably complex budget thing where it requires a majority vote called reconciliation. That is the most complex, convoluted thing because that's what's happening right now, which is crazy. President Biden is an old-time senator. He was in it since 1974. He was in the Senate before he became vice president in 2009. And he just loves the Senate. And he wants to keep the filibuster, but he is now leaning more and more to maybe limiting the filibuster, which actually most Americans don't even know exists. They can't figure out why things aren't done. My guess is when I told you about it, only a few of you knew about it. Doesn't mean it means it's just one of the things that people don't talk about. And that's why don't they get things done? Well, they made the rules. I think they should get rid of it. And whoever's the majority, you pass laws because that's what they want. The Constitution was whoever has the majority vote would win in the Senate, but that's not the way they make the rules. Republicans are a majority, Democrats a majority, whatever it might be, they should make the laws. I'm a lunatic, though. Right? So at that, then what of the executive? Oh, almost forgot. So this favors small states, doesn't it? This was meant on purpose to appease small states, to get them to say, okay, we'll give you a body where you're overrepresented. Because think about it, Montana has what, 40, or Montana has 1 million, and California has 43 or 45 million on that. We both have the same number of senators. So that means our senators represent significant, or our vote for senator has significant more weight than the Californians vote. So we're overrepresented in the Senate. Well, way over, however you want, but we're way over. But it was on purpose to appease the small states. I should add, there are some people that say this was done to protect slave states. And it would, on the road, almost certainly protect slave states. But when they wrote it, no. They weren't quite thinking that way, because this directly affected the small states, which included states where nobody lived, like Georgia. No one lived in North Carolina either at this time. But also Connecticut and Rhode Island. So that's not, you hear that? There are a lot of things done to protect slavery. That was not one. So the executive. They finally chose an executive. Madison wanted it to be chosen by the House. But instead, they decided it would be chosen by this thing they just kind of made up called electors. It would meet what's called the Electoral College. And there had to be a majority. That means, by law, 50% plus 1. Minimum. Which is just majority. And it's a 4-year term. 4-year term. How many terms? Unlimited. But in 47, they amended the Constitution to limit it to 2. And an exhausted Washington could not run for another term. He just didn't want to do it. So he was elected for 2 terms. And that kind of set the precedent, even though a lot of other people wanted to run for more than 2. Jefferson wanted to run for another one, Roosevelt, Grant. But only one president has been elected for more than 2 terms. Who? Yeah, Franklin Roosevelt. 4 terms. And so with that, but he died just a few months after he was inaugurated on his 4th. Right? A month before Germany's run World War II. So, I forgot to add this, so write this down. If nobody has the majority, it goes to the House. If nobody has the majority, it goes to the House. But if the House, each state with 1 vote. Each state. So California and Montana have the same number of votes. And that's what Madison really thought would happen. Madison thought there'd be a bunch of, he had this idealistic version. It's hard not to get this idealistic version. You're like, oh, we all agree on this new document. So it'll be all these like-minded people come together and the House will choose the best person. Well, no, very quickly, even the elites have different points of view on which direction the country should go. Even elites, it's not weird with it. That's what he thought. They kind of thought the Electoral College would go away. It's here. Who chooses electors? In each state, it's state assemblies. And that is still the way the Constitution is written today. That has not been amended. The states choose, state assemblies choose it. Yeah.
So it's the House and the Senate?
Yeah. And I'm using the term they would have called it then, but we might say like legislatures. And they choose it. Now, by the 1820s, part of the wave of what we consider to be democracy in the United States would begin in the U.S., kind of personified by Andrew Jackson. We'll get to more Andrew Jackson. A shockingly complex character. But states started allowing voters to choose the electors. And so that's what you have to ask. Today, voters choose the electors in every state. But technically, in almost every state, it would be very easy for the legislators to say, we're going to go back to state assemblies. And in 2000, that's what the Trump administration tried to get states like Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Georgia to do. To say, we're going to discount what the voters wanted, and we're going to choose these. We're going to discount the vote and choose the electorate. That did not happen, but it still could happen. So basically, the voters can be discounted. And most people don't know that. People, when they go in and vote, they think they vote for president. You don't vote for president. When I went in and voted, so I voted in every presidential election since, have I told you my first presidential election I voted in? 1924, Coolidge, John Davis, and then there was a third party, we all remember, John La Follette. And so when I went in and voted for La Follette in 1924, I do remember that. There's a long line to vote. So when I voted in 2020, I did not vote for Trump or Biden. I voted technically for 3 electors pledged to vote for Trump or Biden. So on the ballot, it said Donald Trump, it said Trump and Pence, it said Biden Harris. It said that. But I'm not voting for them. I'm voting for electors pledged to them. Some states, they actually will put down, like Biden, like my brother lives in Ohio, and they actually list the electors pledged to them. And then Trump and list the electors. And you vote for them all as a group. And then in every state, whoever wins, they let the voters choose, whoever wins the majority in that state gets all the electors. All of them. And that's the way the presidential elections are done. And so that's why you see the map of the, well, now it's blue state and red state, but it used to not be like that. But the different color states, who wins, that's because they get all of the electors. It's winner take all. And you'll notice, this, voters choose, it's winner take all. And so put something in the margin, like something to tie it all together. That is why we have a 2-party state. Winner take all countries have 2 parties, and only 2. The third parties are the minor parties are always, by definition, going to be small. Because in winner take all, if there's a third party, they'll take away votes from one of the other 2. And so people realize I can't vote for a third party because then the person I want or at least hate the least won't win. So they have to join one of the other parties. And that's why we have 2. That's why we have 2. And you'll notice for both parties, a lot for the Republicans, even more for the Democrats, it's really spread out what they believe in. That's because we're stuck with that. Countries like Germany, where they do proportional, so you get 15% of the vote, you get 15% of the member of the Bundesrat, their legislature, you get 50%, you get seats. So how many parties do they have? They have 8 major parties and another 20 that always have a chance to get seats. Italy's like that, France is like that. It's different. If you feel like you're not represented by the parties, you might like that system better. But that's not what the US has. Britain is like that. Canada is like that. Australia is like that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are actually 3 parties in Australia, but what happens is in their parliamentary districts, one of the 2 major parties that just doesn't exist, and that's it. Canada does too. It's called the New Democratic Party. And they're a third party, but that's because their Liberal Party just doesn't exist in some areas. So we're kind of stuck with it. So if you don't like the 2-party state, there's no way to get around it. Yes, you can complain about both parties, which I do all the time, but we're stuck. Okay. So, the choice by state assembly. That means the popular vote doesn't matter on the national level. It only matters within states to pick the electorate. Does everyone got that? And so there could be significantly more people who want one person to be president across the country. But all that matters is if in the state elections, they could pick electors that would vote for somebody else. And how many electors does each state have? What decides that? Montana had 3 in 2020. 2024, there's going to be 4. It's partially population, kind of. 4, 3. How many senators per state? What's the minimum numbers of members of the House each state must have? 1. Montana had 1 member of the House and 2 members of the Senate. Now Montana's going to have 2 members of the House. That's what it was when I was your age. So Montana's going to have 4 electorates. So it is by members of Congress. So you're partially right about population, but then every state gets at least 2. Every state. And so the popular vote doesn't matter nationwide, only matters within states to choose the electors. So you can have a situation where you have 2 people running, and candidate A is not even on the ballot in 42 states. Not even on the ballot. But in the other 8, wins each of those states by 1 vote. They get all the electors in those 8 states. This happen to be the 8 biggest states, and they can be elected president. So that is the system that was created. Yeah.
Isn't the electoral college used so that California and New York population?
Actually, no, it does the exact opposite. Think about what it does. Who does it favor? Small states. Favor small states. Dramatically. So let's get to that. Who's it favor? Small states. It favors them dramatically.
And then popular.
No, the popular vote wouldn't be count because our vote will count the same as New York's in an election. In the popular vote. My vote will count the same as someone in New York.
If there's 43, let's say 43 in New York, there's another years.
Then there'll be 44 million total votes, right? And my vote will count the same as someone from New York, as your would too in 2 years. So it wouldn't matter. Now, you might say, I'm different from someone in New York, but it would just be a big, massive pool of votes. So the states wouldn't matter. It's hard to get out of the state thing because we're so used to electoral college. So if you think about just all of these voters, and there would be just, actually, Montana might actually be more important. Because, or not even Montana, think about a state like Wyoming. Wyoming votes overwhelmingly Republican. So why even bother with those votes? But in the close election, where popular vote matters, the votes in Wyoming might matter more. Because we have to win all the votes. Why does it favor small states, though? How many people are in California again? About 43 million. How many are Montana? 9. We get 3 electors. They get 55. Well, now it's going to be 54. But in the last election, we had 3. They had 55. Now, they actually gained population, but not as fast as other states, so they lost a seat. Because there's only 435 members that got to bounce them around, move them around. We got one. Because we gained population. See these states? Now let's divvy up. This is, okay, the Senate, every state gets 2. That means we get 2 for a small state, California gets 2 for a massive state. And if you compare it by population, here are the counties. Now this is 2016. And I use this one because In 2016, President Trump was elected president in the Electoral College, and yet had almost 4 million less votes than Hillary Clinton nationwide. And so these are all the counties that voted for President Trump were on red. Okay, let me tell you really fast how the red state, blue state thing happened. Because, so when color TV came about, I know you're thinking, wait, how do we get to television? So they broadcast elections. And if states, if they win all the electoral votes in the state, they would designate them by, well, first off, black and white, they just would have to put down Democrat or Republican. But once you had color TV, they put a color for each state, say who won the state. Right? Logical? And then since it's the US, red, white, and blue, they divvied all the major television networks, they divided up red and blue. Makes sense? And they just alternated each year. So the Republicans would be red one year, blue the next election. So in 1996, the Democrats were red, the Republicans were blue. 2000, they just switched. Make sense? The election was so controversial because it came down to one state, Florida, where basically contested electors in Florida. So Al Gore, the Democrat, won the popular vote, but it's contested in Florida. And for a month, there was a fight about this, and Republicans did not want to recount. The Supreme Court eventually agreed with Republicans, and there would be no recount of Florida. So Bush got the votes. But for a month, over a month and a half, they kept showing this map of Republicans in red and Democrats in blue. Thus the red state, blue state thing now. It's kind of silly if you think about it, but now we're stuck with it. So that is if it happened that short ago, let me give you an example to my point of view. I was teaching in this room when that happened. So to me, that's not very long ago. You're sitting at the very same desk I had in that room. I've had these desks for a quarter century in my room. Does that feel a little weird? Once I say that, it does make me feel a little weird. Time to go. See ya. No, I'm out here. I quit. Yes.
So the House of Representatives argue like this?
Numbers of members of the House, and they choose the electors by the number of members of the House and the Senate, the Congress together. And then what happens is each state chooses the electors. What happens now is like Democrats will choose in Montana, the next election, they'll choose 4 electors. Republicans will choose 4. And then whoever wins, they'll get those 4. Other parties can too, but because we have a two-part or a winner-take-all, they don't do it.
If an elector vote for president,
Technically, yes. And that's a real gray area. The Supreme Court has ruled kind of both ways on both. Montana state constitution says they must vote for the person they're pledged to. But what are you going to do? It's federal. So it's really hard. So technically they could go. And that happened in 2016. A lot of people said, well, electors should vote for Clinton because she legitimately won. But they were pledged to Trump, and they were Trump supporters. So they're going to vote for Trump. And so here's a map of the counties. Now this expands the size of the counties by population. And you see how the map looks a little bit different if you compare by population. For example, this is LA County. LA County is like 5 times bigger than Montana population-wise. And so that gives you a different idea of how we compare to population. That's 2016. And that's how close the vote was. Pretty close. But this is what I want to show you. This is 2020. And these are the voters per electoral. And in South Dakota, there was 166,000 voters per elector. Montana, I say South Dakota, I meant North Dakota. The Dakotas. Do we even count them? Montana, 255,000. California, 418,000 per electoral. That's how it favors small states. But let's be clear, there's a lot more votes there in California. Wow. Look at Wyoming. Their individual voters matter a lot more than individual voters even in Montana. I should add, DC, the Constitution was ratified or amended in 73. DC has 3 electors. They can't vote for House or the Senate, but they get electors in electoral college. So how many total electors are there? Math, it's math time. Let's do the math. How many electors? How many members of the House? I told you what? How many members of the Senate? How many members from DC in the Electoral College? So how many total? From the Senate? 538. How many does the president need to be elected? 7. 7. It's 269. No one has a majority, and it goes to the House. That's where we're at now. And that's the way the map looks now. That will be the next election, and that'll be all up to 2030. Look good? Nebraska, 4. 3 from here. By the way, Puerto Rico, American citizens, all citizens of the United States of America, every single person there, no votes in the Electoral College, no votes in the Senate or the House. And their population is significantly bigger than, let's say, Montana. So there's a lot of people that are American citizens that are left out of this. DC, you can imagine how they complain. They got electors. So with that, the next big compromise. 3/5 compromise. By the way, wouldn't this make a good essay question? The compromises behind the Constitution? I know what you're thinking. Any question's a good question for an essay, right? I actually very much agree. Looking at the AP exam last year, I felt sorry for one class, The other 2, great essay questions. Last year, I think they had 3 different choices, or they just randomly had 3 different questions. And it was definitely 2 of them were a lot better, which is annoying. How about that? Do you like my shrug? Oh, well. So with that, every 10 years there's a census. We just had one in 2020. And the census then, and the big reason for the census is they have to reapportion Congress. Now, before they would add seats. Now they got to bounce around the 435. So that's why it was just announced a few months ago that Montana got a 2nd member or seat. I should add, Montana is one of the states, most states don't have this, but Montana has a bipartisan reapportionment committee, and they're the ones drawing the lines. And they literally just settled on 9 different maps, and they'll choose one of them in the next couple months. Right now, that just happened today. They chose 9 maps. There are 5 members of it, 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, one nonpartisan, and everyone kind of put maps in and they'll choose one. And it really matters, wherever you put the line, how the seats will go. Eastern will go Republican without a doubt. Who's the only member of the House in the state of Montana now? Matt Rosendale from Glinda. And so he's going to run in the East without a doubt. He's running the East for re-election. So in the West, and it all depends on where they put the cities. The cities in Montana are, for the most part, slightly Democratic. Once you leave the city limits, it is pretty much all Republican. And so that's what that's where they draw the lines. Does that make sense? That's where we're at right now. So let's get back to this. Okay, so they choose by representation, right? Does that make sense? But the other one is this. I gotta quit saying that makes sense. Why did I put a line there? Was I gonna write something? I put a hyphen. All right. But they also thought they would do taxation by population too. This is pre-capitalism, what we call income today. So what they thought was, New York would collect taxes, Rhode Island would collect taxes. And then they would pay that tax as a percentage of their population to the federal government. So the bigger the population, the more taxes they would pay. And that's the way they thought they would administer taxes. They thought they would do that in the Articles of Confederation. That didn't happen. So taxation by population. By the way, that's a rough draft of the Constitution. I'll explain in just a second. The North, you can imagine, they wanted slaves to be counted. Because it's a real issue. Who do you count? Only citizens? Only voters? Only people of European descent? Or do you count everybody, including slaves, including American Indians? And it really depended upon where you're at. But representation, I think you can imagine. Southern states had significant more to slavery. They wanted slaves counted for this. So what's the compromise? We will count everybody at the census. But then they must designate, or their owners will designate for the slaves, whether or not that they are slaves. And then they will take these slaves, and then for every 1,000 slaves, they will count it 600 people towards their population, or 3/5 of a person towards population. So, you have 1,000 slaves, your population goes up by 600. And this was a big issue because everyone acknowledged one very basic fact. If you're a slave, you are not a citizen. They do not have the rights of citizens. They cannot vote. They're slaves. And since both or virtually every state had a vested interest, they fought to count slaves as at least partial a person. What it meant then is in the census, and this is what we have to get down, put it in the margin. If they're counting slaves, that means they're counting everybody. Regardless if they're a citizen of the United States or not, they're counted in the census. And so American Indians, if they live in a state, will be counted towards the population, yet they are not citizens. In fact, American Indians would not get full citizenship in the United States until 1921, which to me is still just mind-boggling. So that means everybody's counted, whether or not they're a citizen of the United States or not, no matter how they got here or not. So when they started to close up borders in the 20th century, you must have documentation. If people are undocumented, they are still counted under the census. And that's a legacy of that. So, and one more thing. Slaves can't vote. They don't have rights. They're just counted as population. Who has the advantage in this? Did this happen? That never happened. They thought it would. The taxation like that never happened. This was a huge advantage to the slave states. And as the South became more and more the only area where there was slavery, for the most part, that's where it was by 1840. Huge advantage. They had more members of the House and therefore more members of the Electoral College. So the Electoral College was not done when they made it to protect slave states. But because of the 3/5 compromise, it would definitely help slave states. And so that meant white voters, so white elite in the South, had more representation and more power in the Electoral College than white voters in the North. Now, what I just said there, that should also tell you how intensely racist the country was. And I'm not even talking about women, who women at this time, those who could vote, would lose the right by 1840. So that, in fact, they would call it they would call it slave power. Slave power. Now, when I say slave power, I don't mean the slaves have power. Who has the power? The slave owners have power. And so this would help them get votes in the House, like the incredibly controversial and divisive Missouri Compromise of 1820. but also big advantage electoral college. Thomas Jefferson would never been elected president without what Northerners called slave power. It would have been John Adams winning re-election, and who knows what would have happened. Because Adams, because of his fear of the growth of Jefferson's republicanism, are you really mad at it? Yeah. He got so mad that if Jefferson wouldn't have been elected, he was going to leave. Adams would have been very reluctant to buy the claim to what's called the Louisiana Purchase. In the area you're sitting in right now, who knows how things would have been different. Napoleon just about changed his mind after he, literally before the ink was dry. Who knows? So, slave power. In fact, Jefferson is going to be called by his political enemies the Negro president. Not because he would do anything for helping people who are not white. It was aka slaves, because he was elected because of slave power. Slave power. And so with that, kind of a big deal. And so if you ever heard that slaves were 3/5 of a person, it's more complex than that, but that's where it comes from. Another compromise, a great paragraph for an essay, don't you think? This is wonderful. Actually, this is a pretty good essay question. This would be the kind, well, they haven't had an essay question on the Constitution and the AP exam in a really long time. Literally over 20 years. And so, it seems like this would be a really good one, don't you think? And of course, the answer, that's why they don't give one. These are all the slaveholding presidents. 2 are outliers. The rest, completely pro-slavery. You know who the outliers are? Actually, he's complex. Lincoln's vice president. Even though he's a president, I will admit, I'm not a fan of him for a very good reason. All the outliers. Grant was given a slave by his father-in-law. He married into a family of slave owners from Missouri, but he hated slavery with freedom. He was opposed to slavery. And do everything he could to try to bring equal rights out to the war. And Van Buren, that was part of his political maneuverings in Washington, D.C., but he would become an abolitionist against slavery. So, this is a great compromise. The last one. So, everybody wanted Congress to regulate trade. Everybody wanted, but there was a real fear in the South that they might regulate trade by cutting off the slave trade. The big thing they were fearful of, they would put a big tax on slaves coming in, a tariff or an excise tax. And the thing is, slaveholding states were worried that if you cut off the flow of kidnapped people from Africa, they couldn't afford slaves anymore. The price was low. So everyone got that. So they thought this was their bottom line. But they also thought slavery was going away down the road, 20, 30 years. So here's the compromise. By the way, this is a picture from 1850, but I thought it worked out pretty good. Congress can regulate commerce, especially interstate commerce. But they could not touch the slave trade except for a tiny tax for 20 years. And Madison, a slave owner, would say, in 20 years, that pernicious institution will go away. Pernicious means evil. They really thought, and this is partially just wishful thinking because they all knew slavery was horrible. And nobody really wants to be an immoral person. They didn't want to give up their nice lives. They just kind of hoping it would just go away. They did not count on the Industrial Revolution just changing everything. Like literally a new world is coming. And don't forget, this is actually a key point. I'll just say it here and I'll say it again. Capitalism had not been developed. The Industrial Revolution had not been developed. The world would literally change 180 degrees totally in the next 50 years. Like a different world is coming. We cannot even comprehend that change. Maybe. Give me this two seconds. Okay.
Oh, so this.
Yeah. Oh, no, Oh, yeah. He's got it. I mean, there's a very good chance I would have missed out, but I didn't hear your fine. Yeah, you're right about population. It's just really hard to get past New York versus Montana because of that. I understand completely. Federalist number 10? What happened here? Were you hungry?
Also, another our school, my clothes.
See what it is, I'll check and I'll be back. If I might have accidentally typed something. If I did, I don't want to, so make sure you check, tell me what it is and I'll check. Sound good?
So, one of the food grades we talked about earlier.
Have I
We have
not
5 quotas. Well, we talked about it with the report, but you said remind me, you just put it in 4 out of 5, not 3 out of 5.
I didn't change it. Let me do it right now.
Can we correct the tests or no?
Huh?
Do we do corrections on the tests?
Well, I said that I'll give you a couple days if you did bad in a couple of the short meetings.
So you want back by Friday?
The test?
Yeah,
I said by Wednesday, today.
you never said that.
Yeah, I did.
Okay, well,
That's what I'm gonna,
okay,
give me by tomorrow.
okay.
Tomorrow. And John, I put it in right now, so I won't forget it, but try not to.
I never took that one quiz. You said to remind them.
And then how long did you wait? A while? I don't even know what quiz it is. What quiz is it? Chapter 5. Let's go.
I'm still in Coco. It's a lunch day and I need to meet 4th period early.
Please.
Okay.
Where do I get off?
Nothing.
No, you're honest about it.
My small notes on it.
Huh?
Or is your
Yeah, the last thing you said. Yeah, last thing you need to know. Yeah.
That's so.
Oh, I got it. You want to say hi to